Sorry, I got interrupted. Anyway, in regards to this, and the two major reasons why some snowblowers throw further than others, being either rotational speed or the gap, most often really it's the gap than anything else. You can take a less expensive machine or one that has a bigger gap and actually put the kit in there, and you could increase its throwing distance and actually make it perform almost nearly as well as an expensive machine. Now granted, expensive machines may be built better, they might have more features, they might be more durable, sometimes a little more power, but you can take a less expensive machine and put the kit in there and get a much better throwing machine that you might otherwise think. And take that old machine that's better built, put a kit in there and make it perform really well like a new one. What's sad though is the gaps aren't necessarily dependent on the manufacturer or even the age. There are a lot of older machines that I've seen that have big gaps and also smaller gaps. I've seen newer machines, again, same thing. And some brands, like Ariens for instance, some of their machines I've seen, the newer machines actually started to increase the gaps and have larger gaps than the older machines. Some machines like Hondas that boast incredible throwing distances, I've seen videos where the guy was putting a kit in one of the, I think a 928 or 6 something Honda, and it had a 3/8 inch gap. 3/8 inch to me is on the bigger side. Usually a good machine will have a gap that's 1/8 of an inch or at least 1/4 of an inch or less. The really bad machines will have 1/2 inch. Now, if you're going out and looking at buying a consumer machine or Home Depot, one of the centers or whatever, home centers, most of the machines out there now are made by MTD. In fact, that includes Craftsman, Boland's, which is very often sold on, as a Canadian line, White, Troy-Bilt, Cub Cadet, Yard Machines, Yardman, MTD. All those are actually made by MTD, and they all have a horrible gap and have for several years now, 1/2 an inch. So that greatly cuts down on their throwing distance. Now another problem that gaps cause is clogging. Now, when I mentioned about centrifugal force, the centrifugal force as the blades are spinning makes all the snow again to go to the outside. Now also, when something is trying to be pushed, an item wants to stay where it is. So it's, for instance, when you're in your car and you accelerate, you feel yourself push against the back of the seat. It's because the car is moving forward, but you are essentially trying to stay where you were. So that's why you feel yourself getting pulled back until you finally catch up to the motion of the car. And same thing when braking. When the car wants to stop, you want to go forward because your body wants to keep moving the same way that it is apart from the car. Well, the snow is trying to be spun, if the chute's over here, this way. So the blade wants to push the snow that way, but the snow wants to stay where it is. So now you have the snow moving to the outside edge of the circle because of centrifugal force. And now the snow wants to stay where it is, which means it wants to go and stay where it is as the blade's moving that way. So the snow actually is going to want to move towards where the gap is and then wants to go through the gap because of the forces that are involved in rotation. So the snow wants to go through the gap. And as that snow falls through, the rest of the snow then moves out in its place and that wants to fall through. So what you have is this, now of course at some point in a quick rotation, of course the snow gets thrown before all of it can fall through. But you have snow falling through and it keeps falling through and it doesn't get thrown. And eventually it gets thrown later, but you have this buildup occurring and you have buildup of snow which doesn't get thrown and it can cause clogs. It also doesn't have as fast of a momentum. On a given RPM, when something's rotating, your actual surface speed of something moving here closer to the center is slower than something out here because it has to travel a further distance than the item in here. But they're actually going to travel the same rotation. So when you have this gap, you're losing this further distance from the center where the rotational speed would actually be faster. So snow's getting thrown from here, which is one speed, whereas with the rubber added and the impeller kit installed, now your snow will be thrown, some snow will be thrown from here, which is now going faster. So you actually have a faster speed and you have a further throwing distance. So there is no question that an impeller kit will increase the throwing distance, will reduce clogging, and the other key feature and biggest one of all, which no stock snow thrower can do, even a Honda or Ariens, is throw slush and water. Because although snow is a solid and it won't fall through a really tiny gap as easily, water and slush will fall through only the tiniest gap. It would be like a water pump or a piston ring in the case of gas or water, with the tiniest gap, and it'll fall through. If a water pump had the tiniest gap and its impeller and its blades pushing the water would ooze through and go through. Well, even the tiniest gap on a machine that has, let's say, even an 1/8 of an inch gap, the water will go right through. And for instance, I have a snapper which came with a really tight gap, and I'll show you a picture of that. And that wouldn't throw slush and water. It throws really far, as good as any of the other expensive models, but it won't throw slush and water. Well, now with that rubber in there filling the gap, as long as it's touching the metal all the way around and creating a seal, it'll actually throw slush and water. So you can take your inexpensive machine, not only make it throw farther, but make it throw slush and water, which again, no stock machine will do. So the kit will add improvements to any machine, even an expensive one. As far as the throwing distance, it just will depend how much improvement you get. If you already have a tight gap on a machine, you won't notice as much throwing and distance improvement, but you will reduce the chances of clogs, be it lesser maybe on a tighter gap machine than on a wider gap machine, but you'll still notice some improvement, and you will definitely be allowed to throw slush and water where or at least you may be able to throw slush and water, which you definitely wouldn't without the kit. Of course, a bigger difference will be noticed on a machine with a bigger gap. You'll notice a greater increase. Now, just an example of machines that I've had, that I have or have sold over the years. These are some differences in gap. This is a well-known snowblower called a Snowbird. And these are sold from the 60s through even the 70s when they went to the newer designs. But these had barrel rolls, actual impeller chambers that rotated with the chute. So the actual chute moved from side to side, not just the head of it. This one was actually from 71, which was a newer machine than I had, if you call that newer. And this one had a 1/2 inch gap. It only threw a couple feet. I used it for a year or so. And I put the kit in there and sold it to a customer, and now it throws across the street. And he loves it. What's funny is an older Snowbird, a predecessor to that other machine, this one was made in 61, which I have in my fleet. This one has a very tight gap. It only has about 1/8 of an inch. And this is the model 262. And if you get on YouTube and look up this machine, 262 or 263, which is a very similar machine, they have a very tight gap and they throw unbelievably far. So you have an older machine that had a tight gap, and you have one that's from 71, 10 years later, and they design it with a bigger gap. Same manufacturer. Well, actually, they were bought out by another company, but they were similar designs. This is a Craftsman, which is, I think, from the late 80s, and this is a design that I like because it has the L handles up top, and you can hold both handles for the auger and impeller down at the same time. These actually were made, I think, by Murray at the time, rather than MTD. It may have been MTD, but all I can say is these machines, this era of Craftsman's, had actually a tighter gap, although I still put kits in all my machines, had a tighter gap than the newer ones, which are now definitely made by MTD. These only had maybe 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch gap, whereas the newer ones, and an example is my Boland's, which is one of the MTD lines, and this is a big one, a 10 horsepower 30 inch, or they call 9.5 29. This one had a 1/2 inch gap, and I put the kit in here right away, and it throws slush and water, and it throws 20, 30 feet, even wet pack snow, it doesn't matter. Those are just some examples. I have a Ford snowblower, believe it or not, which is actually made by Jacobson, same exact machine. They just put the Ford name on it. I sold this to a customer. I put the kit in here. This one had a horrible 1/2 inch gap, only threw a couple feet. Put the kit in there, and I haven't seen it used, but my customer raves about how far it throws. So let's just give you an idea. This is a home light, which was actually made by Simplicity, and this had a fairly big gap, had a 2-blade design, which is unusual. And this one actually had a peerless transmission, which is different from the disc drive. But anyway, these are just some different machines. But also to show you here the gap. This is my Boland's, and this shows it with the kit installed. And that's a 1/2 inch gap. You can see how big it is with my finger, and you can see the rubber there completely creating a seal. I had to cut a notch in the two sides because of where the bolts are that hold the chute assembly on, just to clear that. Again, here's a picture of that with the rubber from the top, the impeller kit installed. Now for an example, this is before my paint job and restoration, but this is a Snapper 10 horsepower 30 inch that I have. And this is stock. You can see how tight the gap is. And this machine throws really far, but it wouldn't throw slush and water. It would come oozing out the chute. Now it's been painted, has the kit, and surely will throw slush and water. So those are just some pictures and some mentions about machines and so forth. Now something else to consider too is in regards to increasing your throwing distance, the kit's going to make the biggest distance. Now the other option would be the RPM of the impeller. And you can change this by putting a bigger pulley on the engine or a smaller one on the auger. Either thing would then increase the rotational speed of the auger and actually increase your miles per hour travel speed of the snow and make it throw further. But there are just some things to bear in mind about wear on the bearings and so forth, which eventually will happen anyway. And too fast could cause other problems. There's some misconceptions about the impeller kit that it'll put too much wear on the engine, it puts too much stress in the engine. When you put this rubber in there, it's going to rub initially, maybe depending on how you install it, might rub against the inside of the housing, but it's rubber and it's going to wear down pretty quickly, wear in if you will, and then it'll basically just barely contact the metal as it wears down and not really create any more friction anymore. So you're not really going to put any stress on the engine. The extra snow that you are so-called throwing is snow that would get thrown anyway and is just ends up getting delayed and thrown an extra revolution or two later, or extra blade pass or two later, rather than being thrown right away. So the impact on your machine is really negligible, and any kind of friction like that really is not going to make that much difference on the engine. So any comments about that or statements, issues about that are really unfounded. The kit makes a big difference. It'll help any machine throw slush and water, which it wouldn't stock. And machines that have bigger gaps, it'll greatly increase your throwing distance. It'll prevent clogging, almost eliminate clogging. If anything, not having the kit in there and having it clog and having to shut the engine off, clear it out, and then start the engine up again, if anything, creates more wear in the engine than just being able to run it continuously and not have to keep shutting it down and starting it up again. Another interesting design that I have on one of my machines is this old Yardman Snowbird, and this was a later generation of those antique machines I showed you. And if you can see in the picture, this has a huge impeller. The assembly behind the auger is gigantic. My bigger 10 horsepower 30 inch machines, such as my Boland's MTD and my Snapper, are 30 inch machines and have a 12 inch impeller. And that's the size of the blade traveling to throw the snow back there. This Yardman is only a 26 inch and has a 14 inch impeller, bigger than the bigger machines. And what that means is you now have longer blades, which now have a bigger circumference to travel, which means faster miles per hour travel speed, assuming that the RPM is the same, and means further throwing and also the ability to move more snow that the auger's passing it in a given amount of time because you have so much more volume and such bigger blades in there. So that's an interesting machine. You can see also it has a very large chute. There was sort of a generation of these machines. Some of them had smaller chutes, or shorter chutes, but they all had huge impellers. So the impeller size can make a difference, and the bigger the chamber and the longer the blade can make a difference in how much snow you can move. One other interesting thing that I always questioned was there was a generation of older Toro machines that had these augers, and if you can see in the picture, the auger shaft actually has this metal shrouding that was built around it that is much bigger diameter than the shaft itself. And that kind of just ate up space in the auger housing, and as far as I'm concerned, must have reduced the amount of snow moving it could do in a given amount of time because you have less snow capacity in the front housing because that extra diameter there took up space. So I never understood why Toro did that, and they actually don't have that on their newer machines. But that was sort of I think a mistake of theirs. Some other things to consider with two-stage snowblowers is they now have actually wheeled skid shoes, and you can find them on eBay or online. They're actually nylon, and they look like a skid shoe, but they're made out of nylon, and they have a wheel in the middle. So what actually comes in contact with the ground is a rolling wheel rather than a metal skid shoe. So you don't have the dragging and scraping of your driveway. They don't wear out and have to be replaced. They pretty much will last a long time or forever. What's interesting also about some of the older snowblowers